The participants in the data shown here are Danny and John, both of whom were college students in Hawaii at the time of the recording. Danny, on the left, is an L1 speaker of Japanese. John, on the right, is an L1 speaker of English who was enrolled in a third-year Japanese course at the time. This conversation was set up as a conversation for learning and was the first time these two had met each other. And as such, the only directions they received were to get to know each other and to use Japanese as much as possible.
私の名前は生まれたのがハワイで育ったのが日本、大阪だから I have 英語のアメリカ、いやいや英語のアメリカの名前も日本の名前もよろしくお願いします。
英語の人は例えば僕はこれだと短いと肉
はいはいはいはい
僕のと長いもの
じゃあがリメで短くしてますで名字がでアメリカの名前がでも3歳までしかハワイにいなかったから英語だから全然ダメ。
Let's do a quick analysis of this excerpt. The conversation begins with very standard greetings, with both Danny and John bowing. Danny then proceeds to give his name. Note that he gives his English name first. Danny then provides some biographical information, which begins to account for why he has an English name. He then provides further information about where he grew up. Note that in many conversations, after one is given their name, the next immediate action due is for the recipient to reciprocate. John really hasn't had the space to do this yet. In line 16, Danny provides the upshot of all this biographical information, using it as an explanation for why he has an English name. As Danny tries to formulate this point, however, he runs into some difficulty and has to conduct a word search, as we see in line 18. Notice that John displays his attentiveness by providing a candidate completion for Danny's word search. Danny then says his Japanese name is Taka, which is a shortened form. In line 26, he closes out his self-introduction with the set phrase, yoroshiku onegai shimasu, which usually opens up space for the other speaker to provide an introduction themselves. John doesn't do this, though. Instead, he launches into a question about Danny, but then runs into some difficulty as evidenced in lines 28 and 29. John then changes tack and launches an example referencing people who speak English, but again runs into further trouble. He then changes tack again and launches into a different example, this time using his own name. This also functions to provide information that was due earlier as part of the self-introduction sequence. John notes that this is his short nickname, communicating this both verbally and through gesture. And Danny's repeated positive responses suggest that he recognizes the relevance of this information in relation to his own self-introduction. In line 41, John refers to his long name, again relying on both verbal and gestural resources, and then launches into a sequence where he states part of his name and Danny repeats it. Again, note how John uses gesture in the process to connote his first, middle, and last names. They continue this sequence in similar fashion. John emphasizes his middle name with an insertion gesture. Note also, as in line 47, that Danny recycles John's gestures in his repetition. In lines 50 and 51, they complete the name and repetition sequence, coming to the end of the exemplification. John then restarts his original question for Danny, which retroactively shows that John's name sequence was aimed to provide Danny with the type of answer he's pursuing. As Danny answers, showing his own understanding of what John was pursuing, he uses similar gestures to those that John had used. He also explains that he shortens his real name as well, recycling an action from John's earlier explanation. After he gives his first name, Danny provides the word myoji, meaning family name, with rising intonation, which functions to check John's recognition of the word. John, in turn, repeats it with a slight nod. Danny provides his family name, but only after a short pause. By separating the noun myoji from the subject particle ga, he provides special emphasis on the noun, as a word that could be useful for John when asking for the information he was asking for. John repeats Danny's family name, and Danny wraps up the sequence by repeating his full name in the standard Japanese order of family name then given name. Danny then provides further clarification about his American name, and then finishes with a comment about his English ability, which begins a movement out of the topic of their names. So let's do a little recap of this data. John, through his pauses and perturbations, orients to difficulty that he's having in formulating his questions. As he works on formulating it, he employs a number of tools, particularly exemplification of the information he is asking for by going through his name step by step, and a variety of gestures that emphasize the ordering of his name. For his part, Danny is cooperative throughout, as we can see through his use of very similar gestures in both his repetitions and his responses, and the extra emphasis he provides on the word myoji, providing an opportunity for John to possibly learn it. In other words, John and Danny have worked together to get through the difficulty. Each step they took and each resource they employed was fit to the immediate context, working toward a goal but sensitive to the unfolding talk. What do you feel are the pros and cons of encouraging students to communicate in this way? Our language faculty discusses these points. How do we use this in our classrooms or in assessments? I mean, do we want to see our students do this kind of thing?
Too much. Not too much.
Why not?
Because that, in a sense, like they can communicate without learning new things, so they can kind of get away from like something we want them to also learn in classroom situations.
Right, I mean, because of course part of our goal of teaching is to get them to use the language, right? We can't always be like the example that Levinson was talking about of being able to use all the gestures and everything. But is that important? Why is that important? What we just said, well, we don't want them to over-rely upon this.
One of the things is like mode of communication is not limited to in-person communication, but saying in writing, all those gestures are not visible to readers, and then students should be able to handle those like non-contextual language use as well. So they can't rely heavily on the gesture in communication. I mean, it's only one type of communication, and it's ignoring the other type of communication.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something even more fundamental. Well, go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
But I think they can. I mean, why not? It's we're teaching them writing, but we're also teaching them oral communication, so they should be able to communicate with their interlocutor in any way that is to get to the goal that they want, which is, in this case, I want to know what is your first name and your last name. And if they don't have the resources and they are able to come up with these resources, even if within this context it's valid, maybe not in another one. So in another context, they can learn other strategies to do that, which is the writing or
Let's
something.
go back
And
first.
also-
Yeah.
And also, it's not only for basic level of understanding. They will reach misunderstandings in a more advanced level, like, I don't know, fourth semester of Spanish or whatever, and they should be ready to see. I mean, for example, we made them like go away and talk with native speakers about really like abstract issues, and they should be able to convey meaning. And maybe they don't have the enough vocabulary, but they will be learning it. I mean, it's an exchange.
And also, I mean, for the conversations that we've been using to evaluate students to assess their interactional competence, I think we would prize a student if the student is able to come up with a strategy that makes sense at that point, which is to substitute a word that he doesn't know with something that makes sense within the interaction, and it's not switching to the student's native language. I think that's what we don't want.
Yeah.
I mean, because if you switch to your native language, then you are giving up.
Yes,
And
the
we
avoidance.
don't want them to give up on the interaction. So I think what we've been, and Miriam and I have been discussing this for so long, because we've been working on this rubric to assess their interactional competence. I mean, we don't care so much if the student doesn't know the word for, last name, even though we worked with that specific word in the classroom, but the student is able to keep the interaction going with, the strategies that the student has at that point. So I think for me, that would be the most important thing.
So I assumed when I took my students to Seville a few years ago that gestures were universal to the extent that we wouldn't have to talk about gestures at all, especially for key, which I think we do key. And I get a call at 10 at night that my intermediate student couldn't get across the idea of the key being physically present with the host mom in front of a door. I mean, in my mind, I was like, really? You're in front of the door, your host mom is there, you don't know how to convey. So gestures, we can't assume that they will have, we can't oversimplify and try to teach them all the gestures, but we also can't assume that, well, they should know gestures are universal, they should know them. I think they have a place, they have a role. And Miriam, with all her examples, we realize that we're teaching them interactional competence in their first language. They don't have this in their first, they're like this and frozen, and gestures are minimal, and I think there's a place for them.
Part of what we're trying to get students to be able to do is design what they're saying for the person that they're talking to. And part of this is kind of precision, right? We try to be precise in our recipient design, unless we have another goal in mind, right? We do try to be precise. And all of these tools, all of these resources are resources or tools for better precision, right? Eventually, we're hoping that students will have the scalpel rather than the hacksaw, right? We're hoping that the students will develop that. And that's part of what we're doing, is trying to help them pick up all these tools. So in the micro context, I do think we want the students to persist like this, right? Because in this case, as I pointed out, by persisting in this way, the L1 speaker then provides the resource that hopefully, now of course I've never done a post-test on this. I do not know if John learned the word myoji. I would like to think that he did. I know that he knows it now, 10 years later. But I don't know if he learned it from this. But Danny provides it. And if this comes up often enough, then John would learn it, right? And so if we take that longer term, then perhaps, these are, a means to an end in that way.